Morning, all. We're going to start off today by looking at the rivalry between the St. Louis Blues and the Chicago Blackhawks, also known as what was once a great Norris Division rivalry. The Norris Division was not the most talented division. They weren't teams that were all contenders, but boy, there could be some really ugly battles. And St. Louis and Chicago really don't like each other. This is just the way that it works. Cubs and Cardinals fans, am I right? Yeah. So, and of course, there was an NFL equivalent. There isn't now. But anyways, that's just let's move on to the Chicago and St. Louis matchup, which traditionally is favored Chicago. Now, when you look at the overall record, 35-28 is the record in favor of Chicago. When you look at the games in the playoffs. And these teams have met when they've both been bad. They've met when they've both been pretty darn good. And no matter what you get, it usually turns out to be a pretty good series. Only one sweep in the time that I've watched these two teams play against each other. They've had 2 sweeps out of 12 matchups overall. The Blackhawks are 8-4 all time against the St. Louis Blues. So when I put these up on the board, I'm just putting up series since I started watching hockey. And for the ones that were before I watched hockey, not a whole lot for me to say about them. The Hawks won 7 of the first 8 games, though, against St. Louis. And when you look at it, they had 2, 3, 4. They won the first 4 meetings, and they won 7 of the first 8. So they pretty much owned the Blues, and that was kind of how that worked. 1982, they meet in round 2. So it's round 1 and round 2 for these guys every time, much like Toronto and Boston. That's how it works when you're in the same division. 4 games to 2 win for the Chicago Blackhawks, though St. Louis had home ice in that round. They had the same amount of points, I believe, that year, and St. Louis just had more wins. 5-4 win in Game 1 on the road for Chicago. They lose Game 2 3-1. They win 6-5 and 7-4 in the next 2 games before they drop Game 5 3-2 in overtime, and then they win Game 6 in a shutout 2-0. Murray Bannerman, Tony Esposito split the net for Chicago. Mike Liut and Glenn Hanlon split the net for St. Louis. So those are 4 pretty darn good goaltenders splitting the nets there for these teams. They meet again in 1983. These teams don't see each other as often as Montreal and Boston, but they see each other a lot. In 83, it's a first-round matchup, so it's a best of 5. Chicago wins that 3-1. They had home ice in that situation. They lost Game 1, 4-2, but then they won 7-2, 2-1, and 5-3. So they won games 3 and 4 in St. Louis. Murray Bannerman and Tony Esposito. Did I say Phil? I just apologize. Tony Esposito split the net in that game, or that series, I should say, and Mike Liut is the goaltender of record for the St. Louis Blues. So Tony Esposito. Sorry, Phil. He might have tried goaltender at some point. I don't know. Now, 1988, again, they meet in round 1. St. Louis has home ice, and they win. So after 4 straight victories, including these 2 for the Hawks, St. Louis finally records victory. It's a 4-1 series, too. They win 4-1 in Game 1, 3-2 in Game 2. In Game 3, they lose 6-2, but then they win 6-5 and 5-3. It's Bob Mason and Darren Pang in net for the Chicago Blackhawks, and it's Greg Millen in net for the St. Louis Blues. Now, 1989, a year later, they meet in round 2. St. Louis has home ice advantage. Chicago had a record of 27, 41, and 12 that year, and St. Louis had a record of 33, 35, and 12. And this was an insane run that Chicago went on that was kind of out of nowhere. And I got to be honest, 1989, I kind of geekily wanted these guys to win maybe the Stanley Cup. I was kind of like, you know what? This team's got a miserable record, but they look good in the playoffs. So in round 2 against St. Louis, they won 3-1 in Game 1. They lost 5-4 in double overtime in Game 2. They won 5-2, 3-2, and 4-2. And then they moved on to play against the Calgary Flames in the next round. It's Alain Chevrier in net for the Chicago Blackhawks and Greg Millen in net for the St. Louis Blues. So Chevrier was the goaltender of record for that series, and very unlikely playoff hero for the Chicago Blackhawks. At some point, I'm going to do a series as well on unlikely playoff runs, and we'll get into that team likely as well. It turned out it bode well for their future, because a year later, the Chicago Blackhawks have home ice in round 2 again against St. Louis yet again. These teams were pretty good in a pretty iffy Norris division, mostly iffy Norris division throughout the 80s anyways. Game 1, they lose 4-3, those Chicago Blackhawks. They then win 5-3 before losing 5-4, so St. Louis had a 2-1 series lead. They went 3-2 and 3-2 to take that lead. They lost Game 6 4-2, but then Game 7, 8-2 victory for Chicago. There were 3 goaltenders who played for Chicago during that series. Belfour, Millen, who had switched teams from St. Louis to Chicago at this point, and Jacques Cloutier. At the other end, it was Vince Riondo and Curtis Joseph for the St. Louis Blues. That was a lot of goaltenders in that series. They take a year away from each other after playing each other 3 years in a row, and in 1992, in round 1, the Chicago Blackhawks, with home ice, beat St. Louis again. So this is that dominance that they had. 4-2. They win 3-1 in Game 1, lose Game 2 5-3. They went down 2-1 in the series with a 5-4 double overtime loss, and then won 3 in a row. 5-3, 6-4, and 2-1. Belfour and Hasek are the goaltenders for Chicago, and Curtis Joseph is the goaltender for St. Louis. Now, they meet again a year later. St. Louis has home ice, or no, St. Louis doesn't have home ice in this one, Chicago does. And it is the one instance where Chicago having home ice doesn't work out for Chicago. St. Louis sweeps them. It's the only time St. Louis has ever swept Chicago in the playoffs. They win 4-3, 2-0, 3-0, and 4-3 in overtime. Curtis Joseph's the goaltender for St. Louis. That, for me, is where that legend really gets going. And Eddie the Eagle Belfour is in net for Chicago. So they take some time away from each other. They take some time away. I'm going to take some time away from talking about their postseason to talk about during the regular season, March 17th, 1991. They had a game that was called the St. Patrick's Day Massacre after because there were 278 penalty minutes in it. These teams don't like each other. But they take time away. 9 years later, 2002, in round 1, the St. Louis Blues have home ice. And they win for the second time in a row. This is the first time, of course, in their team's history they'll have won 2 straight series against the Chicago Blackhawks. They win it in 5. So that means they've won 8 of their last 9 against the Chicago Blackhawks in the playoffs at the end of the 2002 series. They lose 2-1 in Game 1, but then they rattle off 4 straight wins. 2-0, 3-0, 1-0, and then 5-3. So there were 2 shutouts for Curtis Joseph in this series, and then in this one, Brent Johnson had 3. At one end of the rink, you got Tebow and Passmore for Chicago. At the other end, you've got Johnson, who put up 3 shutouts and a .959 save percentage. Yeah, and that's in round 1. So Brent Johnson shuts Chicago down. They don't meet again for 12 years. 12. And then it's a round 1 matchup, and the Chicago Blackhawks emerge victorious in 6, even though St. Louis had home ice in that. They lost Game 1 in triple overtime, 4-3. They lost the next one again in overtime, 4-3. And then the victories start 2-0, 4-3 in overtime. Then they go back to St. Louis. They win 3-2 in overtime. Come home and they win 5-1. At one end of the rink, you've got Corey Crawford, and at the other, it's Ryan Miller. So after Game 2, Ryan Miller, yep, this is why we brought him in. This is a St. Louis team that's going to change the narrative. It's a St. Louis team that's finally going to do something. Ryan Miller's been traded out of Buffalo. He has a chance to win it, and he puts up an .897 save percentage. And there were a lot of critics of him after that series and after just his play in St. Louis. Didn't really fit for him, and then, of course, he would go to Vancouver, where he played well for a team that wasn't really a contender either. So these teams take a year off. 2015, they don't play each other. 2016, they start up that rivalry again. St. Louis against Chicago. Now, I remember before that series predicting Chicago would win it. And part of the reason I said that is because, well, Chicago usually beats St. Louis. St. Louis fans at the time, rightfully, took some offense because 2 of the last 3 meetings had been won by St. Louis. I was looking at the all-time record, which was 8-3 in favor of the Chicago Blackhawks, and just remembering some of these series. And yeah, Chicago traditionally does beat St. Louis. Now, in Game 1, at home, St. Louis wins in overtime 1-0. They then lose 3-2 in Game 2. Game 3 is won by St. Louis 3-2, and they win Game 4 4-3. But St. Louis, who have lost a 3-1 series lead before, They do it again. They lose 4-3 in double overtime in Game 5. They lose 6-3 in Game 6 before eking out a victory in Game 7, 3-2. It's Corey Crawford for the Hawks, and it's Elliott in net for the Blues. So Elliott had a nice little series there, and they do actually manage to knock out the Blackhawks in 2016 on their way to a conference finals appearance. So the overall series that I've watched, Chicago has beaten St. Louis 6 times out of 10. Home ice advantage has mattered, the same number, 6 times out of 10. And again, in 1989, the 27, 41, and 12 Hawks went on this improbable run. And the Hawks did beat them twice before I watched hockey. But overall, 3 of the last 4 meetings have been won by St. Louis. It feels like the tide has turned. And when you look at the standings at the pause and everything, St. Louis definitely is the better team right now. So it's a storyline that has definitely changed over the last 25 years. But traditionally, it was a bad matchup for St. Louis. Recently, that hasn't been the case. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And there are a lot of rivalries to look over in this series. And there are definitely a lot of teams that, you know, get to know each other. And this is why I don't mind seeing some of the same matchups year in and year out, because you get those rivalries and it can make for some really, really intense playoffs. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.